My name is Priscilla Lundstrom, and I was 22 years old the night my family decided I no longer belonged to them. Even now, years later, that sentence still feels unreal when I say it out loud, as if it happened to someone else. As if there should be an asterisk at the end, some clarification that explains how a family can erase one of their own in a single evening. But there isn't. There was no misunderstanding, no slow buildup, no chance to defend myself. Just a decision, swift, emotional, and final. Back then, I had just finished college and moved back into my parents' house, not because I was irresponsible or drifting, but because I had landed my first real job and wanted to save money before renting my own place. My parents had agreed to the arrangement. They even encouraged it, saying it made sense to get on my feet properly before rushing into adulthood. At least that's what they told me. I was always the second child, the unplanned one. My older sister, Heather, was 15 years older than me. By the time I was learning how to tie my shoes, she was already a teenager with her own car, her own opinions, and her own gravity. We grew up under the same roof, but we were never close. Not because we fought, but because she never really saw me as an equal, more like an accessory, something that existed on the edge of her life. Heather had always been the center of my parents' universe. Her achievements were celebrated loudly. Her failures were treated gently. Her emotions set the tone of the household, whether she lived there or not. I learned early on that harmony in our family meant keeping Heather comfortable. So when she showed up at my parents' house one afternoon, sobbing so hard she could barely stand, I knew instinctively that everything was about to change. She announced that she was divorcing her husband, Paul. My parents rushed to her side, panic and sympathy written all over their faces. Heather cried into my mother's shoulder and said she'd finally had enough, that Paul had been cheating on her, that he'd betrayed her for months, that she couldn't do it anymore. I remember standing there, frozen, watching the scene unfold like I was invisible. No one asked for details. No one asked for proof. They didn't need it. Heather was hurting, and that was enough. Then she looked at me. Her eyes were red but sharp, focused. And that's when she said my name. She accused me of introducing Paul to the woman he'd supposedly been having an affair with, a female friend of mine named Megan. Megan had been trying to gain weight at the time, and Paul, who was a licensed dietitian, had offered to help her professionally. I had made the introduction casually, without thinking twice. It hadn't felt significant then. Just two people crossing paths through me. Heather twisted it into something ugly. She said I had enabled the affair, that I'd set them up, that I'd destroyed her marriage. At first, I actually laughed, a short, disbelieving sound I couldn't stop. The accusation was so absurd, so detached from reality, that my brain rejected it outright. But the room stayed silent. My parents didn't laugh. They didn't question her. They didn't turn to me and ask what really happened. They just stared at me like something fragile inside them had cracked. Heather kept crying, kept talking, kept repeating the same story until it sounded rehearsed, inevitable. And somehow by the end of it, I was the villain. My parents told me they were disgusted by what I'd done, that they couldn't believe I'd betray my own sister like that they'd raise me better. I tried to explain. I told them I had no idea what Heather was talking about, that Megan and Paul had only interacted professionally, that I wasn't responsible for anyone else's marriage. They wouldn't hear it. They said Heather needed peace, space, support. And apparently that meant I had to go. That night, they gave me an ultimatum. Leave quietly, or they'd force me out. By the next morning, I was standing on the sidewalk with 2 bags of clothes, and my entire life compressed into what I could carry. No warning, no plan, no backup. I sat there for almost an hour, crying into my sleeves while cars passed by, completely unaware that my world had just collapsed. I spent that night on a friend's couch. The next day, I tried calling my parents. No answer. The day after that, my calls went straight to voicemail. By the 3rd day, I was blocked. When I tried going back to the house to talk to them in person, my mother shouted through the door that she would call the police if I didn't leave immediately. That was the moment I understood this wasn't temporary. They had chosen Heather, and in doing so, they had chosen to erase me. I was homeless overnight, blamed for something I hadn't done, cast out without evidence, without a conversation, without mercy. And standing there on the pavement, clutching my bags, I remember thinking, not why are they doing this, but how could they do this so easily? I didn't know it then, but that night would mark the beginning of the longest silence of my life. The silence that followed wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't come with screaming phone calls or desperate apologies. It came quietly, creeping into my life one unanswered call at a time until I realized there was nothing left to wait for. After my mother threatened to call the police, I stopped trying to go back. I told myself it was temporary, that my parents were emotional, that Heather was fragile, that once things settled, someone would reach out. People didn't just cut off their children forever. Families didn't end like that. I was wrong. Weeks passed, then months. No messages, no check-ins, no accidental texts sent to the wrong number. I might as well have died. The first few weeks were the hardest. I moved between friends' apartments, never staying long enough to feel like a burden, but long enough to feel like I didn't belong anywhere. I slept lightly, always alert, always aware that my welcome had an expiration date. Eventually, I found a tiny studio apartment I could barely afford. The walls were thin, the carpet smelled faintly of mildew, and the radiator knocked all night like it was trying to escape. But it was mine. And for the first time since being kicked out, I felt something close to safety. At night, though, the questions came back. Heather's story didn't make sense. I replayed everything in my head. The timing, the accusation, the way my parents had accepted her words without hesitation. The more distance I had from the chaos, the more wrong it felt. So I did the one thing I'd been avoiding. I reached out to Megan. We weren't close friends, more like acquaintances who'd crossed paths through shared circles. When I asked to meet, she sounded confused, but agreed. We sat in a cafe, steam curling up from our mugs, and I told her everything. Her reaction wasn't guilt, it wasn't panic. It was shock. She stared at me like I'd just accused her of something she couldn't even comprehend. Then she laughed, not mockingly, but in disbelief. She told me she'd only seen Paul a handful of times, always in a professional context. Short conversations, nutrition advice, nothing more. She even pulled out her phone and showed me photos of her long-term boyfriend, casually mentioning they'd been talking about marriage. There was no hesitation in her voice, no cracks in her story. I believed her, and that belief shattered something inside me. Because if Megan was telling the truth, then Heather wasn't confused or mistaken. She was lying. But belief isn't proof, and proof was the one thing I didn't have. I tried contacting Paul, hoping he could clear things up. My messages never went through. I later found out he'd blocked me, along with the rest of my family. At the time, I didn't understand why. It felt like another door slamming shut for no reason at all. With no evidence and no allies, there was nothing I could do. No version of the truth that would be heard, no path back. For a long time, I still wanted reconciliation. I imagined sitting across from my parents at the kitchen table, calmly explaining everything, watching realization dawn on their faces. I imagined apologies, tears, regret, but slowly that hope rotted. I threw myself into work instead. Long hours, extra shifts, promotions earned through exhaustion rather than ambition. Survival became my only goal. If I stayed busy enough, I didn't have to think about the fact that my own family had erased me without a second thought. Years passed like that. The pain didn't disappear. It just became quieter, less sharp. I stopped checking my phone whenever it buzzed, stopped bracing myself whenever I passed a car that looked like my parents. I learned how to exist without expecting anything from them. Somewhere along the way, I met Daniel. He didn't come into my life during a dramatic breakdown or a moment of desperation. He met me when I was already standing on my own, guarded, careful, and self-sufficient. I never told him everything at once, just pieces. Enough for him to understand that my family wasn't part of my life, and likely never would be. He didn't push, he didn't ask me to fix things. He just stayed. 7 years after being kicked out, he asked me to marry him. For the first time, my future felt solid, chosen, safe. I truly believed the past was behind me. That's when the email arrived. No name, no greeting. Just a subject line that made my chest tighten before I even opened it. You were never the problem. I stared at the screen for a long time before I opened the email. The subject line alone felt like someone reaching into my chest and squeezing. You were never the problem. It was the kind of sentence that sounded comforting on the surface, but dangerous underneath. Because if it was true, then everything I had spent 7 years forcing myself to accept was built on a lie. I almost closed the tab. For a moment, I considered pretending I'd never seen it. My life was stable. I was engaged. I was finally at peace. Digging up the past felt reckless, like deliberately reopening a wound that had only just stopped bleeding. But curiosity won. The email was long, detailed, calm in a way that suggested it had been written and rewritten many times. It was from Paul, Heather's ex-husband. He explained that he was contacting me anonymously because he didn't want to disrupt my life or reopen old wounds unnecessarily. He admitted he'd blocked me years ago out of anger and shame, and that doing so had been a mistake he'd carried with him ever since. Then he told me the truth. Heather had been the one cheating. Not once, not impulsively, but consistently, over months, with someone she'd met through me, a male friend named Frank who worked at a grocery store near their house at the time. Paul said he'd discovered the affair accidentally, stumbling across messages that didn't make sense at first and then couldn't be ignored. When he confronted Heather, she panicked. She told him it was all my fault. She claimed I had introduced her to Frank, encouraged their friendship, and even helped them keep things quiet. She framed herself as the victim of manipulation, betrayal stacked on top of betrayal. And in her version of events, I wasn't just involved, I was the architect. It was fiction, every word of it. Paul attached screenshots of emails Heather had sent to Frank, pages and pages of messages filled with declarations of love, plans to meet, jokes about how easy it was to fool him. She'd signed them using her middle name, something only a handful of people knew. There was no denying it. As I scrolled, my hands started shaking. Not from shock, something colder than that, a deep, aching recognition. This was what the truth looked like. Ugly, unapologetic, documented. Paul explained that during the divorce, Heather had leaned heavily on my parents for financial support. Admitting the truth would have cost her that safety net, so she doubled down on the lie. Never corrected it, never looked back. He also admitted that he'd blocked my entire family out of pure rage. He hadn't wanted to hear any explanations. He hadn't wanted to think. And by the time he realized the damage that decision had caused, years had passed. Too many to fix. I sat there for a long time after finishing the email, staring at the wall, trying to process the weight of it all. 7 years. 7 years of homelessness, silence, self-doubt, and grief, built on a lie so fragile it couldn't survive daylight. Daniel found me like that when he got home, sitting on the couch, laptop still open, eyes unfocused. He didn't speak at first. He just sat next to me and waited. When I finally told him everything, he didn't interrupt. He didn't ask what I planned to do. He asked how I felt. And the answer surprised me. I wasn't screaming. I wasn't crying. I was calm. A kind of clarity had settled over me. Sharp, focused, undeniable. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want closure in the way people usually mean it. I wanted the truth to exist where it had been erased. Paul and I met in person a few days later. He apologized again, this time without defensiveness or excuses. I forgave him, not because he deserved it, but because I needed his cooperation. Because now that I had the truth, I knew exactly where it belonged. Back where the lie had started. I hadn't been back to my parents' house in 7 years. As Daniel drove, the neighborhood came into view piece by piece. Same streets, same hedges, same mailbox with peeling paint. Time had moved on everywhere except here. That realization alone felt like confirmation of everything I'd learned. Paul met us a block away. We didn't hug. We didn't need to. There was a quiet understanding between us, forged not from friendship, but from shared damage. My mother answered the door. For half a second, her face softened with recognition. Then it hardened into something defensive, rehearsed. She didn't ask why I was there. She didn't ask how I'd found them. She simply stepped aside as if bracing for impact. My father was in the living room. Heather was there too. She froze the moment she saw me. The color drained from her face so quickly, it almost looked theatrical. She stood up, then sat back down, then stood again, like her body couldn't decide whether to fight or flee. My father demanded to know what was going on. His voice was sharp, authoritative, as if that tone had ever protected me before. Paul didn't waste time. He laid the documents out on the coffee table. Divorce papers, screenshots, emails, dates, names. I watched my parents' expressions shift in slow motion, from confusion to disbelief to something darker, something closer to fear. Heather tried to speak. She cried, she denied, she blamed stress, she blamed misunderstanding, she blamed everyone except herself. But lies collapse under weight. Paul explained everything calmly, methodically. He told them about Frank, about the messages, about how Heather had framed me to save herself. He told them about the family heirloom, the diamond ring she'd been forced to give up in the divorce settlement because she couldn't afford to pay him otherwise. My parents looked at her like they were seeing her for the first time. My father stood up and told Heather to pack her things. Immediately. She screamed. She begged. She turned toward me, eyes wild, accusing me of destroying her life. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. She was handed her bags and pushed out the same door I'd been forced through years earlier. The symmetry wasn't lost on anyone. Neither was the silence that followed. My parents tried to speak to me then. They said they'd made a mistake, that they'd believed the wrong person, that families deserved second chances. They never apologized. Not really. Daniel squeezed my hand as we left. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Heather didn't disappear quietly. She showed up at my apartment days later, demanding forgiveness, demanding intervention, demanding that I fix this. When I refused, she accused me of being cruel. When I blocked her, she found new ways to reach me. Eventually, I called the police. My parents bailed her out. Of course they did. They started messaging me too. Long texts about forgiveness, about weddings, about how they deserved to be there for my big day. As if nothing had happened. As if 7 years of abandonment could be erased with an invitation. Daniel and I read the messages together, not with anger, but with something close to disbelief. It was almost surreal how entitled they sounded, how certain they were that access to my life was still theirs to claim. I told them no. I blocked them. And then something unexpected happened. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was calm. Weeks passed without interruption. I stopped flinching when my phone buzzed, stopped checking locks twice at night, stopped rehearsing arguments that would never come. Daniel noticed before I did. "You're not living defensively anymore," he said one evening. He was right. Grief came after that. Not for my parents or Heather, but for the younger version of me who believed fairness was guaranteed, who believed love was earned by endurance, who thought silence was strength. Therapy helped. So did honesty. So did choosing peace over proximity. When Daniel and I planned our wedding, we kept it small, intentional, filled only with people who had shown up without conditions. Heather tried one last time to contact me months later, a long email filled with self-pity and revisionism, claims of growth without accountability, forgiveness without apology. I archived it and moved on. The wedding was simple, honest, real. As I watched Daniel walk toward me, I felt something settle into place. Not triumph, not revenge, belonging. The life that followed wasn't dramatic. It was ordinary in the best possible way. Shared routines, small arguments, work stress, laughter that didn't feel earned through suffering. Sometimes I hear updates about my parents or Heather through other people. Nothing redemptive, nothing catastrophic, just more of the same. And when people ask if I regret what happened, I tell them the truth. Regret implies loss. What I lost was an illusion. The night I was kicked out, terrified, homeless, and blamed, felt like an ending. But it was actually the moment my life began to belong to me. 7 years later, I understand that justice wasn't watching my sister fall. It was watching her become irrelevant. Watching my parents lose their authority over my sense of self. Watching my name become something I lived instead of defended. Being cast out didn't ruin my life. It gave me the chance to build one that didn't require permission. And that was worth everything.